For the next 20 minutes or so, I want to take a step back for a moment. I don't want to talk about machine learning. I don't really want to talk about data collection methodologies, and I absolutely don't want to talk about Salesforce. I want to take a step back and look at what data and evidence more broadly can do, and what its power is to change how we work. So just for a moment, I want to take you out of the social sector and take a look elsewhere. For most of history, if you were ill, there was a good chance the cure would be worse than the malady. Doctors, apothecaries, traditional healers, and your granny, everyone would have a pretty strong opinion on how to treat you. There was no regulation, no agreement on how to treat you, or indeed, most of the time, what was even wrong with you in the first place. Peddlers, some more honest than others, would sell you their miracle cure for pretty much anything. Some of them, by chance, actually had an effect. Any guesses which of these might have actually had some medical benefit? It's actually the snake oil liniment. Turns out that genuine snake oil used in traditional Chinese medicine actually works pretty well as a topical painkiller and is very high in omega-3 acids. Sort of had a good effect on you if you're a 19th century railway worker with bad access to any other healthcare. But even so, given that it was pretty much a random lottery about whether it would help you or not, what changed between that means that we no longer bleed you if you're feeling poorly? How did medical science come on leaps and bounds to the point at which successfully treat cancer sometimes, perform neurosurgery, and indeed design and produce enough vaccine to immunize entire countries? I think that the history of science is a vital lesson for us as a sector. We too are dealing with a whole array of incredibly complicated, diverse ailments faced by society. They are nuanced, fascinating, and often tragic issues, many of which has plagued us for centuries and continue to do so now. Our approach to philanthropy and charity is not really a million miles away from the 19th century. Many of our practices are still in this mold and are dictated by what we have done before and what we could get funded, rather than what evidence would say necessarily works. Limited resources is obviously a problem. Foundations have limited resources and structural problems in the way that they work, and tend to give to organizations they already have existing relationships with. Fundraising from the public is really hard. Government funding is unreliable. Scientists in days of yore had a similar set of problems, if not worse. You needed royal patronage or a rich family. Those are really your best options. So how do they progress? How can we progress as a sector? What happened between the 17th century and the 21st century that led to the explosion in scientific progress? Well, the massive injection of wealth as a result of building extractive imperial structures obviously helped, but that kind of wealth accumulation had happened before elsewhere without corresponding scientific progress. No, the change was due to two things: the spread of the printing press and the so-called Republic of Letters. The problem was that before printing, years was a painstaking process. If any of you have ever read or watched The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, a murder mystery set in a monastery where monks copy and illuminate manuscripts painstakingly by hand, which is an excellent turn by a very young Christian Bale and Sean Connery, the whole premise revolves around a central question: did Christ laugh? But it would give you a sense of the difficulty and time involved in copying out books and manuscripts. For example, it took about 15 months for one person to copy the Bible. But then, remarkable, printing. Miraculously, suddenly you don't have to rely on a small set of religious acolytes living on a mountain for the spread and preservation of ideas. Printing took time to spread and to come down in cost, but by the 17th century there was a printing press in most towns. Newspapers and pamphlets were starting to become a thing, and suddenly knowledge was infinitely more accessible. Obviously, as we know today from a quick glance at Fox News, not everything which is broadcast is true. Plenty of rubbish was put out, in medical and scientific circles as much as anywhere else. But now ideas can be circulated, argued, and discussed. Institutions like the Royal Society sprang up, the results of experiments were published, theories were debunked. These things obviously took time. Poor literacy and lack of regulation meant poor science continued. Anyone fancy a jade egg? But it was thanks to that great circulation on not just ideas, but evidence of what had happened in experiments that scientific progress suddenly went into overdrive. So what does it mean for us? What can we learn from this? Thankfully, we're not 18th century doctors trying to kill smallpox, but we are trying to make a positive impact on people and the planet. But how do we know if what we're doing is having an impact? Impact monitoring has become something of a dirty word, counting beans, odd metrics, with no clear and tangible benefit. But impact monitoring feels a bit sometimes like trying to record the outcomes of every single treatment by every single medical practitioner in every century in every language over the last millennium. A lot of it is really hard to compare. So how do we start building up evidence of what we're doing? How do we start really starting to dig into what works and evidence base for it? Well, at the easier end of the spectrum, some of what we're doing is directly comparable. If you're trying to preserve acres standard, or maybe protect a species of bird in farmland environments, or help a community business become a going concern. These are all tangible, more or less comparable outcomes. The outcome alone isn't enough, even at the more concrete end of the spectrum. We need to know what the intervention was, what the scheme was, what happened, really a robust evaluation. And this doesn't have to be a so-called gold standard randomized control trial. These aren't always possibly appropriate, but just a good appraisal of what occurred. Better, ideally, than the smiley face tick box approach. Of course, evaluations and progress reports and core work aren't exactly something new. The problem is that more often than not, they're kept private, eyes only for those directly involved and the funders. They're made public. They're often only findable on individual charity websites or short-lived project sites, or just disappear into the ether with the next website refresh. The problem is, where do these live in the long term? If we want to make real progress as a sector, make a real difference, and understand exactly what we're doing, we need to entirely reassess how we use, and most importantly, how we share evidence. This isn't just about hard quantitative data, but the qualitative too. All of it is evidence for different approaches and will tell us something about what we should do next time. We need to be able to find relevant research, reports, and evaluations, not just from our closed network and personal archives, but beyond that. We need to have the space to discuss what this evidence is telling you, to review, and to ask questions. Foundations and charities need to about
what's taking place,
what has worked and what hasn't. This is how we will have our own semblance of something looking like a scientific revolution. And I think this is how we can have the most impact in our work. Before the pandemic, I was looking at taking this idea a step further and whether we could build up a library of evidence for the social sector. Unfortunately, the pandemic put pause to that, but if any of you, foundations, charities, interested parties are interested in discussing, I would love to pick up again and look at how we might possibly look at building a repository or somewhere where people can share evidence in a way that then becomes more accessible for commenting and critique, and where we can look up what has happened before in a particular area. But until then, the next time you're writing a report or compiling a data set, please think about making it public and share it with the world. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or want to have any thoughts, then I would love to hear from you. Thank you everyone for listening to me ramble after I came up with the idea a few weeks ago. I wanted to talk about this. If any of you have any thoughts or any questions, it would be great to talk to you. If otherwise people prefer to follow up afterwards, I'm putting my email address in the chat. So please feel free to get in touch. Ali asked, what are we evidencing? Need, intervention, outcomes, impact, all of it. I think the short answer is kind of yes, all of it. I think we need to understand, essentially, I think we need to understand if we are taking an action for an intervention, then we need to have a look at, we need to be able to understand what that intervention is, have it out in the open, then look at what the results were, analyze those, and then compare them to other approaches that have been made before to tackle a similar issue. I think that just registering what outcomes are made, what the outputs are, what impact is, only really gets you so far unless you have a good understanding of what exactly it was that was done to intervene. I know that in the social investment sector, there's quite kind of a move at the moment towards at least categorizing your investments by what level of intervention, what level of benefit it's going to have on society. You're being generally asked to kind of self-identify kind of what level. But the problem is for me is that I think that's kind of interesting, but unless you have a lot of detail about what that company is doing or what the intervention is that company is doing, then it's really hard to work out what is actually more effective here than not, particularly when you're dealing with different rates of capitalization and so on. But it's still an interesting bit of work. Matt asks, is this repository something within the scope of organizations like the British Library? So I did have a conversation with the British Library pre-pandemic about this, because there was a previous effort to this effect run by the Centre for Third Sector Society, I believe it's called, which is part of the University of Birmingham. And they had about 10 years ago developed a portal of this kind that was a bit more academically focused and had quite a high threshold of what they were looking for. And they were looking to deposit things. And one of the main essentially, perhaps unsurprisingly, after about 2 years, they ran out of funding. Part of the reason for the issue, what we're running it, is essentially a team of people who was manually uploading each of the things themselves. I think that in this day and age, about 6 or 7 years later, there is a more user-centric way of doing this, which puts more effort in terms of people putting up more information and data on what they're doing, but means that I think it might be both more robust, more engaging, and more sustainable as an initiative. That rambled on my point. The British Library does actually have that archive, which exists in that previous form. So I'd be hoping that we could access it. If we wanted to take this forward, that's something we could then access to join together. Any other questions? If not, you can all have 20 minutes back of your lunch break. Well, I'll take that as a no. As I say, if any of you want to get in touch and discuss, then would very much like to hear from you all. And otherwise, thank you very much.